Hi guys, so welcome to the second part of this lesson. This lesson we're going to focus on the case study of, or the case topic of abortion in light of our understanding of reproduction. How do we make sense of the abortion laws in Victoria and just the topic in general? Okay, so how this lesson is going to work is actually, this is more of in response to some of the discussions that we are going to have in our meeting. And so I want you to consider the for and the against arguments and where you stand with this. So hopefully it'll be a bit more interactive, be an opportunity for you guys to actually write down some of your own notes and things like that. Okay, let me go through kind of the abortion laws in Victoria. So at the moment, abortion is legal to 24 weeks in Victoria. So what that means is it is fully legal for any female to abort her pregnancy up until 24 weeks. Yeah, so she has 24 weeks from when she falls pregnant to then decide if she wants to abort the baby. Okay, now abortion is still legal post 24 weeks if she has two doctors' approval. In other words, if both doctors see that there is a legitimate cause for abortion, then they will sign off on the approval and she'll be able to still conduct the abortion after 24 weeks. It's also illegal to protest within 150 meters of the abortion service or the clinic, right? And that's just to kind of protect the individual and protect their dignity and things like that, where they don't really want that kind of stuff, this protesting, causing guilt, influencing their decision-making, etc. So what I want you to do is you can actually just hit pause on the video, and I want you to consider, in this topic of abortion, what are some arguments for abortion and what are some arguments against abortion. Yeah, so before we even start talking about the 24 weeks, I want you to just consider in general arguments for and against, and then I also want you to think about, in light of this 24 weeks, what other considerations need to be made. You know, is this too late? Is it too early? Should it just be any time? Why is it 24 weeks, etc.? So you're free to use the internet, whatever you want to use to kind of research main arguments, or you're free to just kind of post up your own opinions on the matter, whether you are for or you are against, and what are the opinions of both. Okay, so hit pause, give that a go, because I'm about to go through some of my thoughts and my responses to this particular topic. Okay, my assumption is that you have written your own arguments and your own considerations, and I'm just going to share some of the ones that I think are prevalent in our debate. Yeah, so there are a few kind of main reasons people would go for and against. Let me just kind of go through some of those reasons with you. Okay, so arguments for abortion, probably the biggest proponent is body autonomy. What that means is that a woman's body is hers, and therefore it is her right to do whatever she wants with her body. In the same way that, you know, no one can force you to donate blood or to give up your organs or whatever, unless you make the decision and the commitment to. No one can force you to do otherwise, right? And so body autonomy is something that we maintain for all individuals, and that's a legal thing, right? That your body belongs to you, and it's your right to do what you want with it. For the most part, so long as you don't harm other people, etc., right? So body autonomy is a big proponent of that. The second argument is the definition of consciousness, right? So whether or not just because you have a embryo or a fetus doesn't mean that it is conscious. So in the last lesson, we actually talked about how the brain was actually formed at 3 weeks. However, rudimentary brain activity doesn't actually occur until 8 weeks into the gestation period, which means there's not really a whole lot of action or going on in the brain space of the baby before then. And to be more specific, coordinated activity, which is what medical science defines as being kind of consciousness, doesn't occur until week 24 to 25 of gestation. So what's interesting is that before then, medically speaking, the human being is not technically alive, because we define whether someone is alive by brain function and not just brain presence. Yeah, so for example, you know, when the brain stops functioning and we don't get a brain signal occurring, that's when we kind of identify time of death, and therefore time of life will not necessarily start until we get a signal, right, which is at 24 weeks plus, right? So that's a really interesting kind of comparison there. Okay, so trauma is also a good one to understand arguments for rape and sexual abuse cases. You know, considering the mental health of a parent and the effects it has on a woman who is raped and then having to fall pregnant to her rapists. And so how that's going to affect the development of a child, having a parent who is traumatized by the experience. And then finally, babies born with disability and the quality of life that's being affected. And so sometimes it can be seen as a merciful stance to abort the baby rather than have the baby enter into the world, especially if we know that the baby will need to be terminated or die from a particular genetic mutation, right? Which we'll look at in the next lesson as well. All right, so those are some of the main arguments for. There's probably a few other things around adjustments to the time frame, etc., but those are some of the main arguments for. Okay. Arguments against. Now, the biggest argument against is this idea of sanctity of life, right? That abortion is no different from murder because by definition, if we want to take a life, life begins at conception and not at birth. So the moment that the egg and the sperm join together, you've got a new life, right? And that new life is developing regardless of whether there's brain activity or heart activity or whatever, right? And if you think about it, other things that we consider as alive, like animals and plants and stuff like that, don't have brains or don't have hearts or organs and stuff like that, but we still consider them as alive. And so, you are still harming a life by aborting a baby, regardless of whether there is brain activity or consciousness of that life, right? So the basic establishment of the baby already has happened within the first 12 weeks, and by extension, people who argue sanctity of life would also argue against processes like IVF, in vitro fertilization, because in many ways, IVF is also violating sanctity of life. In IVF, what they do is they are combining artificially the sperm and the egg together in a test tube or a vial, and then they will then implant it into the female for it to grow into a baby. Now, majority of IVF embryos are actually terminated because they don't survive outside of in the vial of the test tube, and only a small portion of which go on to develop into a baby. So in that kind of way, you're artificially creating life non-stop and then just implanting a few of them to see if they can grow, and the rest don't survive, and then they're usually given to research or disposed of, right? So sanctity of life is a really big argument against. Other ones are more mitigations. For example, adoption could be an option rather than to abort, to give the baby up for adoption, particularly if the mother is a victim of rape or sexual abuse. Methodology can sometimes be a big mitigation as well. So methodology, the methods of abortion can be quite cruel and inhumane. So there's a few methods, vacuum aspiration, dilation and curette, and partial birth. I'll briefly explain what they are, yeah? Vacuum aspiration is basically, what you're doing is if the baby is born early enough, you can just kind of, and you're planning to abort, then it can just be sucked out using a vacuum, and then the contents of the uterus then is removed, and the baby is aborted. Particularly if it's small, yeah? Dilation and curette is the use of a surgical tool to dismantle a developing embryo or fetus and to then remove it from the female's body, right? It's quite graphic and it's quite severe if you think about it. And then finally, partial birth is when you are getting you're stimulating a birth of the baby, and it's partially stimulated and then removed from the female. Yeah. Now, these methodologies can be quite cruel and inhumane, but they're particularly exacerbated by this 24-week time frame. But at 24 weeks, the baby is pretty much already the size of, like, let's say, a cantaloupe, right? And so it's already quite large, and these methods can be seen as quite hard, quite cruel at that stage already. And so the earlier it is, the kind of the quicker and more inhumane the process can be, right? And then finally, we've got the special circumstance abortion. In other words, that abortion should only be made available in special circumstances, and the blanket should be a no, but in case of earlier things. And in these situations, they advocate for an earlier cutoff time, right? And so, pushing the time forward might make it a bit more okay to abort than to push it back later, right? And that's a really interesting, even just the time frame, determining the time frame is interesting. You can see in Victoria it's legal at 24 weeks, mainly probably because of this coordinated activity definition of consciousness time frame, right? But also, a later time frame can also be an advocate for keeping the baby as well, because the longer an individual has to make the decision, sometimes the more of a right decision can be made instead of a wrong decision. And so actually it might be better because, by giving them more time, females can decide to actually keep the baby as opposed to abort the baby because there's an attachment that grows over time, right? And so having a later time frame can actually be a good thing rather than a bad thing. But once again, if they then decide to abort, the methods are much more cruel because the baby is more developed, okay? So that's a really interesting thing to consider. Now, how do we look at it from a redemptive point of view? Yeah, so, we looked at Psalm 139 earlier in lesson 1, and we had this understanding that, that we are wonderfully and fearfully made, and there's this poetic kind of definition of how God already knew us before we were born. And so from that perspective, from a Christian perspective, that God desires and has a plan for all individuals, regardless of how, they came about, right? And so how do we understand that part where it is God's plan that, life is treasured, life is sanctified, life is kept, but then also consider the realistic situation of, situations around rape and trauma, etc., etc. And to understand that, I just want to frame it in a few different ways, right? You've got this kind of aspect where people's opinions are sometimes more than just their opinions. It's not just a thought that people had, but sometimes people feel strongly about their opinions because these opinions are laced with emotions, right? They're particularly passionate about certain topics because they mean something to them. There is a principle and a value underlying these emotions, and beneath these principles and values are often the worldview and experiences that individuals have, whether that be trauma or whether they know somebody or whether they have experienced it themselves, right? And so you can't discount someone's opinion because sometimes there is something deeper beneath that. And my goal is for you guys to understand both the worldview and the experience of people that kind of informs their opinion, right? And so if I was to look at 4 arguments and against from this biblical redemptive view, you have to understand that that there is a certain element of that people are broken. Humanity is broken as a result of the fall. And so God gives people a choice and a free will, and that is a human dignity to have choice and free will. But we also understand that sickness and disease has occurred because of a broken humanity. And so we have to accept that the world is broken and to be a beacon of light and redemption, not a source of condemnation. So for the follower of Jesus, our goal is to save people and bring them into a relationship with God as a beacon of light, not as a source of condemnation, right? And so if we go around and we are, passionately, outspokenly going against abortion, then, sometimes we might drive people away feeling as if they are judged, feeling as if Christians don't really understand them and there is no compassion there. Whereas, Jesus is a very compassionate person and he has a lot of understanding for people and their suffering, right? And so understanding people's suffering is important as well. However, at the same time, the argument against this is that there is a rights and responsibility wrestle that we have to understand as people, right? We often have an overinflated sense of right and an underinflated sense of responsibility as people, right? And so the issue of abortion has come about probably in the first place because of predominantly, not all cases, but predominantly unsafe sex practices. That people are not being wise in the way that they are practicing sex, and they are not using protection, etc., resulting in an unwanted pregnancy. And if to take it one step further, people are not abstaining from sex outside of the context of marriage, from a Christian point of view, obviously. And as a result of that, abortion has become an issue. Now, not all situations are the same, but poor choice and irresponsibility does play a role in the number of abortions that we're getting. If people are practicing safe sex or abstaining from sex, etc., then the issue might not be as big as it is today. So understanding that and not simply tolerating it is important as well. So for the Christian, it's wrestling between the two of, this is something that I value and it's my opinion and my principle, but then also how do I love the person while speaking truth. So in Ephesians 4:15, God actually encourages us to speak the truth, but speak it in a loving way, right? Where we'll grow to become every respect the mature body, the mature person of him that is Jesus Christ. So we're following the example of Christ by being mature in our approach. Yeah, so my question for you guys is, are you speaking your opinion, your understanding, your truth in a manner that is loving to the person who is suffering from this situation? Okay. All right, we're going to leave it there. And then next lesson, we're going to look at genetic mutation. So I'll see you guys then. All right, see ya.